What's up world, and welcome to Linux for Power Users. My name is Jonathan and I'll be your host on this series. As I said, my name is Jonathan, and in today's video I'll be going over your mindset. That kind of came out wrong. As I said, my name is Jonathan, and in today's video I'll be talking about your mindset. Your mindset in regards to approaching Linux. Also, I'll be debunking a few misconceptions that people seem to have about Linux, and then to present to you a brand new image of Linux. Alright then. So when it comes to your mindset when approaching Linux, well, I wouldn't say that there's a right mindset, but there's a process behind it. I'll break it down for you into three mindsets. First, you have the curious one, which is where most Linux users actually start, where it's curiosity that gets you involved or that gets you to start using Linux in the first place. It's when you've heard about Linux one way or another, and now you're curious to know what it is, and you try it out in virtual machines, or you just boot up the live CD of it, or USB nowadays, and yeah, you're just trying it out. This is the primary stage. Or maybe there's just one piece of software that you heard about that's only for Linux. Plain simple, it's curiosity. You just want to find out. You'd like to know what's behind the curtain, so you look. Now the second mindset, or the second stage, would be the explorer. The mindset of the explorer. This one right here I like to refer to as the risk taker, because this is the stage where you're in the right mindset to actually try Linux beyond just a live booting of it or using it in a virtual environment, but rather to go as far as to dual booting, which means installing it on half of your machine. Now, for those of you who don't know what dual booting is, it's when you put two operating systems side by side on the same machine. Now, you can do this with Windows and Linux, and with OS X and Windows or Linux, or even both sometimes, which is like triple booting or so. You can't dual boot OS X on a Windows machine. I mean, unless you make it a Hackintosh, I believe, which is illegal if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, so dual booting is having two operating systems installed on your system on the same machine. So the explorer is the one that's willing to go one step further, who's willing to look under the hood. How does this work? Like, how does it actually run on my machine? The explorer mindset comes after Linux has grabbed your attention, after You've seen something in it. Out of curiosity, you looked at it, but now you're willing to explore deeper into what Linux is. And then finally, you have the productive, aka the migrant, seeker of productivity. This is when now you're close to taking the decision of switching entirely to Linux, or you find yourself using Linux more and more, and you're not so attached to having this comfortable idea that both the curious one and the explorer might have, which is to have your alternative OS right there, right on the side, so that you can always jump back to it if things get too complicated. You start breaking out of this stage at the end of your explorer days, which comes after you've explored Linux to a certain point that you feel comfortable in it. It's not that you know everything, but that you're now comfortable enough to run it as your main OS. Or to go as far as installing it on your second machine or your primary machine and having a secondary one with a different OS just in case. Now, once you get to the productive state, why I call it the migrant is because now you're switching entirely your workflow and your resources and everything, switching over or migrating over to Linux. This is when you make the big switch. Now, throughout each of these steps, it's always safe to back up your data, because with risk comes the need for precautions. Now, if you're going to go and do a boot, which means installing another operating system alongside your already existing operating system, it's best to back up your data. Now, anyone who's at a certain level of productivity knows that at some point you need to back up your data. It's just the right thing to do, to have a backup of your data so that if anything goes wrong, at least you have a sort of safe key. Now, for these three mindsets, the curious, the explorer, and the productive one, you can see them as a Russian doll, the matryoshka, which is to have one inside of the other. And at the core, which one do you think belongs at the core? The curious one. Curiosity has to always be there when exploring Linux or when working in Linux, because you have to be curious enough to look around, because there are new innovations all the time. Now that layer of curiosity is to be wrapped inside of a desire to explore. Why? Because you might be curious and not do anything about it. Now you need to be able to explore the will to want to go out there and try it out for yourself. And then finally, wrap it up in the productive, which is now you're curious enough to keep up to date. You're willing to explore, which means you will actually try the software and look for what works best for your needs, and you're getting work done. You're looking for productivity. That doesn't change throughout the platforms, but you can't expect the system to function like your previous system. For example, you're not going to go from Windows to OS X hoping that OS X is going to function like Windows, nor will you go to Windows coming from OS X hoping that Windows will function as OS X did. The same has to be applied for Linux. It's a whole new system. You can't expect it to work like your previous system did. It's not very likely that you will get it all right on the first try. I mean, it is possible, but in the end, you're still going to end up having to tweak or modify your system to your liking. Now, for a few misconceptions in regards to Linux. Misconception number 1. I talked about it in my previous video, that Linux is an operating system. I've already gone over that, and no, Linux is not an operating system. It's a kernel. It's the kernel at the core of the operating system, which is GNU. Misconception number 2. Linux has terrible driver support. Again, that is not true. Most of the time you hear people complaining about the fact that Linux doesn't work with their old printers. Now, the key word here being old. The older the printer, the less likely it is to actually work with Linux, which is not a Linux fault, but a manufacturer fault. But that can all be resolved by using a bit more modern machines, not to mention that Linux is receiving driver support every year. And I'm saying every year just to expand the time span of how much support is given to it throughout the year. Misconception number 3. There isn't any decent software available for Linux. Now that is, I don't know where people get the idea from. Maybe back in 2006, you might have been missing some software, but nowadays you have nearly every piece of software that you could need to run on Linux. Linux has a lot of software available to it. Misconception number 4. Linux is only for developers and computer experts. Well, that's just wrong. Right there, that is just wrong. To think that Linux is too complicated for the average user. There are a number of distros that are directed or built for new users. Distros that take into consideration simplicity, ease of use, and of course functionality. You don't need to be tech savvy to use Linux. Try to think about how many people actually install Windows themselves. Misconception number 5. Linux has no support. 5 or 10 years ago, that might have been true. And even back then, there was a certain amount of support. But nowadays, Linux has great support. Lots of distros even have their own community with support and information and people that are just there to help you use Linux. Misconception number 6. Linux will behave like Windows. Again, as I said before, you wouldn't expect Windows to work like OS X, nor would you expect OS X to work like Windows. So no, Linux will not behave like OS X and it will not behave like Windows. Linux is its own thing. It has its own way of functioning. Misconception number 7. Windows software looks better than Linux software. Now, this is not even really a big issue. It's more a question of aesthetics, I suppose. But no, Windows software doesn't necessarily look better than Linux software. Matter of fact, a lot of Linux software looks better than most of the other software out there. Especially if you're going into the GNU looking software, which is just made to look nice and feel comfortable when using, not to mention to be functional. Misconception number 8. You have to be a geek to use Linux. Well, again, same example as I took earlier. Ask yourself this, or ask around, how many people with no computer system knowledge have installed Windows themselves? Not many, if any. Why? Because it takes a certain level of knowledge in computer systems to even be able to get down to some more complex tasks, even though installing it is not that complex. So you don't have to be a geek to actually know how to use Linux or learn how to use Linux. If you want to get deeper under the hood, then yes, for any operating system, you would need to develop computer skills or build your computer knowledge in order to go under the hood. And Linux is no different. There are distros that are aimed at newcomers. These distros hold up three main values: ease of use, simplicity, and functionality. So no, you don't have to be a geek to use Linux. Last but not least, misconception number 9, you can learn Linux on a virtual machine. No. As I said earlier, when it comes to the 3 different mindsets that one needs to adopt in order to really integrate, in order to function properly when discovering Linux or getting into Linux. At the curious stage, you might use a virtual environment to discover Linux, but it would not be enough for you to learn Linux. You need a hands-on experience with Linux to actually discover it and learn what is Linux and how it functions. When you get to the Explorer stage, where you might start dual booting, then you will get a more hands-on experience with Linux, giving you better chances of learning how Linux functions. But in the curious stage, where you're just trying it out either from live distros, which means booting a distribution live, or using it in a virtual desktop environment, you just won't learn Linux. You might be able to discover it a bit, but you won't actually learn Linux. So that's it for the misconceptions. Now, before I continue, a quick recap on the main points. 1. There are 3 different stages of mindsets that one needs to embody and layer one on top of the other in order to have a smooth experience or smooth crossing over to Linux, which is to go from the curious one to the explorer to the creative. Curiosity at the core, wrapped in the will to explore, and then to build on that productive layer, which is productivity on Linux while using Linux. Then, to not forget that trial and error is what will form you in Linux, and to always remember to back up your data. When there's risk, there is the need for precautions. Backing up your data is just one of these precautions. Now, for the new Linux image. Most people have a deprecated image of Linux. And I'm not talking about the live CD images, I'm talking about how they perceive Linux. So, Linux today is user-friendly, desktop-ready, and laptop-ready. It has been running on servers since way before, which means this is not something of today. When it comes to driver support and hardware, there is a lot more driver support today for Linux than there was 3 years ago. There is hardware built for Linux, which means built with Linux in mind. If it is within your means, you can simply buy a computer which comes with Linux pre-installed. When it comes to the hardware, look at it this way. OS X only works on Apple computers, at least it's made to run on Apple computers. Windows, most computers or laptops are built with the idea that it will be running Windows. So it's kind of like a predetermined support. Now, Linux is having hardware built with Linux in mind. If you're looking to avoid any hardware related headaches, just go with hardware that was built for Linux. You got Pogo Linux, which makes a beast of servers. System 76, which makes laptops and desktops built with Linux in mind. They come with Linux pre-installed. You have certain Dell computers that come with Linux, which means there are options now out there for hardware when it comes to Linux. In the next episode, I'll be talking about the open source ecosystem, and I'll be going over these things a bit more in depth. Right now, this machine behind me, which is a MacBook Pro, is running Linux natively installed. I'm not dual booting, nor am I running it in a virtual machine. And I've been running Linux on it natively installed for the past 5 years, and it just works. So what is Linux today? Linux is a functional operating system with lots of options to offer to its users in terms of distributions, desktop environment, package managers, plus the software that it runs. So let's recap real quick. There are 3 main mindsets to go through and adopt in order to have a smooth transition over to Linux. Trial and error is where you will actually discover Linux in depth. Always back up your data. Back up your data. I mean, I cannot stress how much backing up your data is actually important, even if you don't do it all of the time, but there has to be a certain consistency and actually backing up your data. Especially if you're going to try and explore Linux, you want to have backups of your data before you start doing that, because you will be messing with your hard disk in terms of reformatting or anything like that to install Linux. This isn't a promise that something will go wrong. It's only advice so that nothing does go wrong, at least for things to be salvageable if anything does go wrong. So Linux today is user-friendly, desktop ready, and laptop. It has already been running on servers. There's Linux hardware now, both from Dell, System 76, Pogo Linux, amongst others. Linux has better driver support than it did 3 years ago. More software is being ported over to Linux, and the software available to Linux is also being maintained, which means that it's only getting better and better and better. Linux might not have been ready a few years ago, but now it actually is ready, and it's only getting better. Also, I interviewed a few people during the making of this series. Amongst them is Micah from Film World, which is a clear example of someone working on Linux and being productive on Linux, running open source software. And I think one closed source software, which is Lightworks, which again is another example of how much is actually available to Linux. It's not all only Linux or open source software. There's other software, as I said, which is being ported over to Linux, and even though they're not necessarily open source, they are still available to you on Linux natively. So that concludes today's video. Any questions, doubt, or suggestions that you may have, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you. Give this video a like if you learned anything new today or if you like what you saw. Subscribe for more content and activate the bell so that you get notifications when the new video comes out. My name is Jonathan. This is Nuxttux Entertainment. You're watching Linux for Power Users, and I'll see you next time.